the number of people who believe that Jesus was real is dropping. And at the same time, there's about 1 person in 5 who thinks that Jesus is just a story, a myth, someone that never existed at all. And there's a growing group of people who just don't know. They come from a background which is not Christian. Maybe they've heard the story, maybe they haven't, but they just don't know about Jesus and who he might have been and what he might have done. So that means here in Australia, when we're talking to our friends, we need to be thinking about how can we persuade them, firstly, to think about Jesus as a real person, and then secondly, to think about Jesus as the Son of God. And there's some really aggressive people that are giving a very, very different message to that. Here's a quote from a man called Richard Dawkins, who you might have heard of. He's an atheist. He's a vehement, passionate, charismatic atheist. This is what he has to say about Jesus. It is even possible to mount a serious, though not widely supported, historic case that Jesus never lived at all, as has been made by, among others, Professor G.A. Wells from the University of London in a number of books, including Did Jesus Exist? And that's just one book that talks about this idea that Jesus never really existed. And there's lots of books and there's lots of documentaries that are pushing out this idea, which is slowly being accepted, that Jesus never existed. And that's really interesting because a generation ago, that is not a belief that was held in this country. And that's something we need to be aware of. Now, this man here, in debate, when he's been pushed about this question, did Jesus exist, he's backpedaled a little bit and said, well, maybe he did. But the fact remains, this book here, The God Delusion, has been sold to 3 million different people, and the book is still in print, and it still is pushing this idea that Jesus did not exist. And so what we're going to do tonight, we're going to look at 3 different lines of evidence which argue that Jesus did exist. He definitely existed as a real person, and more than that, he is the Son of God as well. So we're going to look at archaeological evidence, historic evidence, and also the Bible texts as well. Hopefully you've got a handout. I can see most people do. Does everyone have a handout? Yes? Everyone? Good? So hopefully you can take some notes as we go, and at the end of this session we'll have some really good points to have in our head to convince people in a very simple way that Jesus is a real person if they don't accept that. So let's start with archaeology. Does anyone know what archaeology is? Maybe? Nobody knows. Everyone's had too much. Sorry? Old physical evidence, exactly. So archaeology is about looking at the past, and it's about looking for physical evidence, so artifacts that we have found. So that's a really important tool for us to use. So if we're going to look for archaeological evidence to support the existence of Jesus as an individual, do you think we would find anything that belonged to this man? Maybe? Some nods? If you think about artifacts, what type of thing do you think is going to survive for 2,000 years or so? Stone things, yep. Anything else? Bones, okay, maybe bones, yep. But not much else. And in the Bible record, how many things out of stone did Jesus build? Nothing. How much did he own? Nothing. He had the clothes on his back, and even those were taken away from him. So he owns absolutely nothing. So we don't expect to find any archaeological evidence for this man specifically. But what we can do is take a step back from Jesus as an individual, and what we can do is find evidence for the places he went to, and the people he interacted with, and the context in which he lived. And that starts to build an evidence base for this man. So, here's a map. Anyone recognize the map? Hopefully everyone. Yep, it's such a dumb question, no one can answer it. Yeah, everyone recognizes it. It's Israel. It's Israel in ancient times. Has anyone here been to Israel? I reckon a few people have. Yes? Does the map of Israel look somewhat like this still today? Yes, it does. And you can start to see here all sorts of places on the map here, like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and Jericho, and Shechem and Sychar, Galilee, all of these places that are right through the record of the Bible, all of these places that Jesus went to. You can go to these places and you can find evidence of what was happening there in the first century. Now, that seems really, really obvious, but if we're thinking about Jesus as a myth, this is important evidence because there are lots of myths that I've read, both religious and not religious, that describe events which don't have a specific place where they take place. They don't have a specific time frame. And in fact, if you go looking for the towns they mention, they never existed. There's no evidence for them. They're myths. They're mysterious places that have never been discovered, but the record of the Bible is not like that. It is nothing like that. All of these places are places that you can go to today, and that is really, really important to keep in our heads. It's so obvious that sometimes we forget that. Now, let's come to some really specific places where Jesus went to. Does anyone recognize where this is? Maybe those who have visited Israel. What was that? Pool of Siloam. Great. That's exactly what it is. Pool of Siloam. So this is the place that was discovered in 2004, so very recently. If you look carefully here, you can see a pipe. Just outside of Jerusalem, they were digging a hole to build a pipeline, and they came across some stone steps, which they then excavated, and they have the Pool of Siloam, a very specific place where Jesus went and did a specific miracle in the biblical record. That's really, really important because prior to 2004, people questioned whether this pool ever existed, and therefore if the miracles took place, and therefore if anything about the story of Jesus took place. But here it is. You can visit there today. It's a real place in Israel that Jesus went to. Here's another archaeological discovery. This one was made in 2013, so a bit more recently. And just up the road from this, another discovery was made that looks very similar to that, and that was discovered in December last year. So really, really contemporary evidence. And this is the ruins of a synagogue in a town called Magdala. Does anyone recognize the town of Magdalene? Yep, there's a connection. So Mary Magdalene lived in this town, probably went to this synagogue, and Jesus most likely taught there. So we're not told in the Bible that Jesus went to Magdala, but what we are told is that he went to towns all around Galilee, and as he went to the synagogue, and he stood in the synagogue, and he preached to people in just places like that, which exist. They're real. And this is dated to the 1st century AD, which is just when Jesus walked the earth. So let's think now about some of the people that we might expect to find evidence for. Again, Jesus' friends, in most cases, were fishermen from Galilee. They owned the clothes on their backs. They owned maybe a house. They owned perhaps a wooden fishing boat. But they weren't building brick aqueducts. They weren't building temples. They weren't building palaces. We don't expect to find any archaeological evidence for Jesus' direct companions. But there are some people in the story of Jesus that did have the means to build things out of stone. Does anyone recognize this particular stone? It's in a museum in Israel. It was discovered in the 1960s, so it's been around for thousands of years, but known to us for a long time. Anyone know? Nope. So this is called the Pilate Stone. The Pilate Stone. And this is what the inscription says. To the divine Augusti, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. So that's an important inscription because we've got a block of stone from the 1st century, which is when Jesus lived, and we've got the name of a man who's in the record of Jesus' life in the Bible. This is what he wrote on a block of stone. He definitely existed at the time of Jesus' life, in the place that's described, and he's got the same title that's described in the Bible as well. So this man definitely walked this earth just like we would expect from the Bible record. If we start to put some of these things together, there's dozens and dozens of places that we might talk about. If we put these things together and start to think about the picture that this makes, we get some really important information. Because people who believe that Jesus is a myth have put forward this idea that there were not Jewish communities in the land of Israel in the 1st century. And the synagogue had not been invented in the 1st century. And the people who lived there didn't speak Greek, which is, of course, the language that the Bible is written in. But when we start to put the evidence together, we can see that, well, firstly, there were definitely Jewish people there, and they definitely had synagogues. And when you start looking inside the synagogues from the 1st century, you can see that they wrote in Hebrew, and they wrote in Greek, and they wrote in Aramaic, just like we would expect from the biblical record. So that's really, really important. And in the Bible story, we also have the Romans who are ruling over this country at this moment in time, and that is exactly what we have archaeological evidence for. So there's a very, very robust case made from archaeology that the record of Jesus' life in the Bible fits the evidence that has been uncovered. Now, let's come across to another line of evidence. This is thinking about historians. So an archaeologist, as Jack told us, is someone who studies the past but uses artifacts to do that. What's a historian, and how do they study the past? Any ideas? Written accounts, yeah. So instead of looking for rocks and things, they start by writing down what they see around them, and then we can uncover what they've written, and we've got a contemporary record of what's happened. So they also study the past or tell us about the past, but they use a different type of evidence. And of course, through time, there's lots of different historians. This man here, called Tacitus, is a Roman historian, and he lived in the 1st century, and he wrote a very detailed history of Rome and the emperors that lived during the first century, among other times. And this man here, Josephus, is a Jewish historian who also lived in the first century, and he wrote a very detailed Jewish history of what happened at that time in the land of Israel. Now, there's something really important about these historians. Tacitus is a Roman. He's not a Christian. And Josephus is a Jew. He is not a Christian. Now, that's really important because these people weren't writing stories which matched what they believed. These people are simply recording what was happening in the earth in the first century. And this is what they have to say. Here's Tacitus. This is from one of his books, the Annals of Roman History. And it was written in about 112 AD. And he writes this: "Hence, to suppress the rumour, that's Nero, he's talking about the Roman Emperor Nero, falsely charged with the guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities." So you can see here that the way he's writing is focused on the Roman emperor, in this case, Nero, because this man's a Roman and he's writing a Roman history. But what he does do is describe people who interacted with the Romans, and the Christians were one such group. And this is what he writes next. "Christus, or Christ, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judah, in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also." So this is looking at what's happening in Judea through a Roman lens. He's not a Christian. He's recording the life of the Caesars, and he refers incidentally to something that happens in Israel. And you can see there's a man called Christ who founds a group of people called the Christians, and he is put to death by Pontius Pilate in Judea during the reign of Tiberius the emperor. So it's very, very specific in what it writes, but it's not very detailed because he's writing about something else. He refers to Jesus as a byline in the story of the history of Rome. But what you can see is he definitely believed that Jesus existed in the earth and interacted with the Roman rulers. So let's have a look at what Josephus has to say. Remember, he's a Jewish historian. He's writing about Jewish history in the land of Israel. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good. He was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. And I think this is very sarcastic at this point, remembering he's a Jewish man. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So here's a Jewish historian relating what's happening in Israel in the first century. He's not a Christian, and he writes incidentally about a man called Jesus who definitely existed. And he lived a life which, if you were to summarize in about 4 or 5 lines, is very similar to the life we read in the New Testament. So that is important evidence. Now, there's a number of other historians from around this time that give us some clues about Jesus as well. Here's a list of them. Most of them don't refer to Jesus specifically, but what they do is talk about the Christians, a group of people who follow Jesus, who explode into the Roman Empire at about the middle of the 1st century, just as described in the Bible record. And if we start to put together all of the things that they describe about this man, you can see that this is very compelling historic evidence. There's a man who definitely existed. There's a man called Jesus, who was called Christ, who had a brother called James. Josephus talks about James, the brother of Jesus, who was killed by the Romans. He won over both Jews and Greeks. The Jewish leaders did not like him. Pilate decided to kill him. He killed him specifically by crucifixion, and we have a date and a place where this happened. That is very precise historic evidence for this man Jesus being real. And that is just what a growing number of people in this country doubt. It's important that we know about this evidence so we can share that with other people. Now, the next piece of evidence that we're going to look at is the Bible text, and I think this is perhaps the most important thing for us to be looking at. If we think about a historian like Tacitus, he's writing a history of Rome, and he really doesn't care about the Jews or about Jesus. He refers to him as a byline in his enormous book. But if we want to learn about Jesus, then very clearly we need to go to a biography about Jesus to get the details about what happened in his life. And in the New Testament, there are 4 biographies: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all record the record of Jesus' life. And that's important because the Bible by itself is a reliable, accurate, historic record that we should put a lot of weight on, and we need to remember that. We're going to look at 3 reasons why it's important. Firstly, there are lots of early copies of the Bible manuscripts. Secondly, they're very contemporary with the events of Jesus' life. What does contemporary mean? Same time, yep. Temporary means time, the same. Same time. These records were written when Jesus was alive or shortly afterwards, probably shortly after his life. And finally, they are consistent, and that is really important to remember. So let's think about this aspect of the biblical records, and that is that there are multiple copies of the early manuscripts of the New Testament. And let's think about why that is important. We read from Luke chapter 2 tonight. Phil did, thank you. And Phil read to us in English because our Bibles are written in English. But of course, the Bible wasn't originally written in English, it was written in Greek. So what we have is a translation of a Greek manuscript, and I'm pretty sure Phil read from the King James Version, and I think the Greek manuscripts from the King James are from about 900-ish AD, so almost 1,000 years after Christ. But those Greek manuscripts from 900 AD were copied from earlier manuscripts. And they didn't have photocopiers. They were written out by hand. So back in the 1st century, Luke takes his pen and he writes on a piece of paper a biography of the life of Christ. And then that copy sits on a shelf somewhere until somebody else decides to copy it out. And they copy the manuscript, and then sometime later it's copied out again. And eventually we get to the manuscript from about 900 AD. And that's the one that we essentially read from tonight. So there's a number of copies in between. And we can ask the question, do we have an accurate copy of what Luke actually wrote? It's 900 years later. How can we be sure that it's really a faithful representation? And one of the reasons we can know that this is a very accurate copy of what Luke wrote is by looking at the number of early manuscripts. And I'll try and explain why that's important. If you think of a tree with a trunk like this, and that tree trunk at the base represents the first manuscript that was written. So Luke has written that down. And each time it's copied, new mistakes come into that text. And maybe the scribe starts to change bits that he doesn't like. So we've got this tree, which is the manuscript that Luke wrote, and then we've got branches, which are all the new copies which are written. And at the end of each of those branches, we have a manuscript with all the errors inside of it. And if we have multiple copies of early manuscripts, it's like we've found something on the end of each branch. And what we can do is trace back those branches, and we can see when the errors crept in and what those errors were by comparing them to one another. And if we've got lots of early manuscripts, what that means is we have a very accurate estimate of exactly what Luke wrote. And that's important because we can be sure that what we have on our laps is probably very close to what Luke wrote. Now, let's have a look on the screen there at a number of other historic documents and the number of copies that are available to give us an accurate picture of what was originally written. Caesar was a historian, and we've got about 10 early copies of what he wrote. Tacitus, who we just read from, we've got about 20 copies of what he wrote. 20. He's one of the key historic sources for the Caesars, particularly Tiberius. Pliny, Herodotus, who wrote quite a bit earlier, 8 copies of what he wrote. And now, the New Testament, 400 copies. We're talking orders of magnitude more copies than other ancient historic manuscripts. We have very accurate estimates of what was originally written, much more so than other historic documents which describe other things in history which we also believe. Now, the next important thing about our Bibles is that the manuscripts we have were very contemporary with the events that they describe. So here's 3 people from history. Let's look at this one. Alexander the Great. He lived in about the 300s BC. And a man called Diodorus wrote a biography about this man. And he wrote that biography in about the 1st century BC. So maybe 150 years after his life. And the earliest copy of his manuscript we have is from the 10th century AD, so 1,000 years later. And we certainly believe that this man existed. There's no doubt about that. Tiberius, a biography written by Tacitus. It was written maybe 80 years later. And again, 900 years later, we've got the first copy of that manuscript. Jesus, he lived at the start of the 1st century. The biography was written within about 30 years of his life. It's very, very contemporary. And the earliest manuscripts are only about 50 years after they were written. Very, very contemporary. So Luke writes his record in the 1st century AD. The first copy we have is from the early 2nd century, really soon, like 50 or 60 years. I'm sure most of us here have got books on our bookshelves that are at least 50 years old. They're not too hard to come by. That's the period of time we're looking at. So this record of Jesus is very, very robust compared to the record of other people's lives in history. And perhaps our last point about the biblical record is that it's consistent. Something we can easily forget is that the New Testament is a collection of books. We've got 4 biographies about Jesus. 1, 2, 3, 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we've got the writings of Paul and the writings of Peter and other letters of John. And we've got the Acts of the Apostles. And all of them consistently tell this story about Jesus. It's not like we've got one manuscript by one author. We've got multiple records of his life, and they are consistent. That is unprecedented for historic people. Now, let's quickly summarize where we've got to so far. Evidence that Jesus was real. Archaeology, the places, people, and context in which Jesus lived are very well attested by archaeology. External historians corroborate very soundly the record of Jesus' life, and the biblical record is a very sound historic source. It's well attested, there's lots of copies, they're contemporary records, and they are consistent records. So that's very important to remember. But, and I think this is where people begin to question whether or not these records are true, and this is when we start to think about the things recorded about Jesus that he did, the miracles, the resurrection, all of these strange supernatural things that we don't see happening around us. And people point to those things and they say, miracles and resurrections and healings are the stuff of myth and legend. And they're right through the record of Jesus. The historians talk about it. They write about miracles. They write about a man being perceived as the Messiah. They write about these strange things that happen after his death. And of course, the Bible record is very clear. Jesus did miracles, he's the Son of God, and he was raised from the dead. So people take the historic evidence that we've looked at so far, and they find inside this evidence a record of things that do not happen. And they throw out the story of Jesus as a myth, because all of these things here are the stuff of myth and legend. And I think we can maybe see why people do that. But perhaps this is where we need to separate out a couple of different things here. Firstly, we can ask the question, did Jesus live? And I think in the historic record and the archaeological evidence and the record of Scripture, we can accept that he lived even if we don't accept the miracles. And I think that's really important. Jesus definitely lived. Now we need to think about this question of miracles. Where do they fit into the record of Jesus' life? Can they actually occur? And if we find ourselves talking to someone who perhaps can accept that Jesus existed but cannot accept the miracles, there's a really important question we can ask them. And that is, what evidence for a miracle would you like to see if you were going to believe that? What evidence would you like to see? And at this point, some people, many people like perhaps Richard Dawkins, will say, miracles do not occur. There's nothing you can show me that will convince me that it's happened. I'll always find another explanation. And if we come to that point, that is a very important conversation we need to have. Is it possible for miracles to occur? Or perhaps can we ask the person to just hold that idea because they have a very fixed belief in their head, try to convince them to put that belief aside just for a moment and examine the evidence. Because if people have a fixed view that miracles cannot occur, there's nothing we can do to convince them otherwise. They've already decided before they see the evidence. So what we need to try and do is convince people to look at the evidence. And I think the biblical evidence is very, very sound. And tonight we'll look at evidence for one miracle, that's the resurrection of Jesus. This is a really important miracle because our whole faith depends on it, and because, why else is it important? Our faith depends on it. It's our hope, yep. And it's the biggest miracle of all, right? It's not just somebody with a sore leg being healed, walking. This is like the most amazing thing you've ever heard about, someone who's dead coming back to life. This is the penultimate miracle in Scripture. And if we have a look at our Bibles, where we have a detailed biography of this man, and we accept that the Bibles might only be a historic record, we haven't quite accepted miracles yet. What we must accept is that they're very robust records, and we've seen the reasons why. And this is what they describe. The selection of an empty garden tomb. This is after Pontius Pilate in Judea, as the prefect, orders his death by crucifixion, all of which the historians talk about. We then have the biography showing us that a garden tomb is selected. There's a burial by two specific people that is witnessed by a group of people who were women who were watching. A stone is rolled in front of the tomb. A Roman guard is put in front of that stone, and the tomb is sealed shut by the Romans. So, how much of that is miraculous? Nothing. It's just a historic record of what happened. It's reasonable to accept that, even if we don't accept miracles. Have a look at where it's described. Luke, John, Mark, Matthew. 4 different writers consistently telling the same story. And we could go to the Acts of the Apostles, which describe the same thing, and we could go to the writings of Paul, which describe the same thing. He died, he was buried, and then something happened. 3 days later, the tomb is empty. Luke, Matthew, and Mark. They describe an empty tomb. And in fact, it's written about in Acts as well. In Acts chapter 2, Peter in Jerusalem stands up and says, "There's an empty tomb just outside. Go and have a look." They talk about this very consistently in the scriptural record. And again, where's the miracle here? There's no miracle in an empty tomb, but there is a miracle in the scriptural record for the cause that it was empty. He was risen from the dead. And if we don't accept the miracles, then we're left in this position of some very robust historic evidence for an empty tomb, and we need to try and explain that without a miracle. And we can do that in a number of different ways. Some people will say that Well, while the Bible record says the tomb was empty, actually it wasn't. There was a body still there. And the people who went to that tomb went to the wrong place. And that's how this myth came to be promoted, that there was an empty tomb. Or they might say it's a legend. Over time, slowly, the Bible manuscripts changed, and over hundreds of years, an empty tomb appeared in the story. Or they might say it's a spiritual resurrection, or they might say that all of these witnesses were hallucinating. There was no empty tomb. They invented these stories in their minds, and they happened to have the same hallucination. And you can see that all of these things are without miracle, but going to the wrong tomb probably is not a convincing explanation. Let's think about Peter, a few days later, standing in Jerusalem saying, Jesus is risen, his tomb is empty, it's just over there. If they'd gone to the wrong tomb, think about the Jewish leaders who vehemently opposed this teaching. They would have pointed to the right tomb. And that would be the end of this explanation. But that didn't happen. Think about this one here. This myth and legend slowly grew over time. Well, I don't think that's true, because the biblical manuscripts are so early that there is no time for a legend to arise. We're talking about less than a generation to the copies that we have. It's a very contemporary record. Hallucinations is actually about where the current non-miraculous explanation is at. All of these people who saw Jesus were mysteriously hallucinating the same thing. That's the current explanation. The alternative is the tomb was empty, but there's a natural cause for this empty tomb. So maybe the disciples stole the body. And again, we've got these disciples overpowering the guards, rolling away the stone, grabbing the body, and people have watched them take it because they know that it's the disciples, but they haven't caught them as they're running away with a 100-kilogram embalmed body into the night. A natural explanation, yes. Is it probable? I don't think it's probable. What about the authorities moving the body so that the tomb is left empty? Again, the authorities hated this teaching that Jesus rose from the dead. If they took the body, all they need to do is reproduce it from their back garden shed or wherever they kept it, and that's the end of the story. They've won. But that didn't happen. The Christians are here, and they came about in history just after the death of Christ, as we would expect. Or the swoon theory. Maybe Jesus on the cross didn't quite die. He went to the tomb. He revived in the tomb. He broke out of the grave clothes. He rolled the stone away. He overpowered the guards, and he staggered off into the night, and the tomb was left empty. Could have happened, maybe. Probably not. Highly unlikely. But people have put forward ideas like this. And I think the latest one that I read about was it wasn't Jesus who died on the cross. It was his twin or his brother who looked just like him, and he died on the cross, and that's why other people saw Jesus afterwards, because he was still alive all along. That's the type of explanation that we're left with if we don't accept this. The tomb was empty because God raised Jesus from the dead. And I think for people who might struggle with this idea of miracles occurring as a bad option to explain the empty tomb, have a look at the alternatives. How convincing are they? And this list of explanations goes on and on and on and on. And all of them have some sort of inconsistency inside of them. They don't quite explain all the facts. And I think it's fair to say that Christ, raised from the dead by the power of God, as described in Scripture, is the best and most convincing evidence for the empty tomb. So let's summarize very briefly what we've seen tonight. Lots of people around us don't believe that Jesus ever existed. And that number of people is growing each year. And quite simply, it is not true. It is not true that Jesus is a myth. He's a real man who walked this earth at exactly the time, in exactly the place that the Bible records. And that is really important. Jesus is described in Scripture as more than a man. He is the Son of God. He performed miracles. And most importantly, his resurrection is of utmost importance to all of us, because without the resurrection of Christ, none of us have any hope. So I'd encourage you to make sure you share with everyone you know the fact that Jesus is real and gives hope to all of us, particularly through his resurrection.